Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about this conversation with my father, Larry Little. He is the first guest that, when asked about his background, goes all the way back to his grandparents and tells the story of the crash in 1929. And we actually, in this conversation, have a number of thematic discussions about the history of America in the last 100 years, very applicable to an entrepreneurial audience. We talk about geopolitical concerns in the world right now, parallels between the 1920s and the 2020s, things to watch out for when starting a business with regard to legal, how to find an attorney, and much, much more. So if you are listening to this episode, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. And if you're watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this wide-ranging and extremely insightful conversation with my father, Larry Little.
Let's start with 1929. Since you're in a business community here, entrepreneurial business community. I think the story of what happened to the family in 1929 is relevant.
Mm-hmm.
It was, just to describe it, this is one of the first times this has been significantly publicly revealed. So I will, you're launching on your podcast here a description of a bank failure, the first bank failure of the Great Depression, 1929. Just happened to be my grandfather and his two brothers. They had tried to rescue a bank that had been in existence for years, century, I think, about a century. And they got a little speculative. Back in the days before the FDIC and other insurance forms, and the bank went under, and all three brothers ended up in jail. Now, I'm not suggesting to your entrepreneurs that are watching this that is a course of action that's going to happen to them, but a word of caution.
Sure.
That occasionally you can do a Bernie Madoff. The more recent example of something like that, but I don't think they were anywhere like Bernie Madoff. My grandfather, who I never knew because he died in jail in approximately 1930, very short time in jail before he died. My mother would tell the story of him that they didn't have very much money at all, and it was a very cold day in New Jersey where they lived. And his father, that would be my grandfather, and my father went into a store to buy a coat, and all they had was enough money to buy the coat. So they bought the coat, walked out of the store, and there, in the freezing cold of that bitter winter day in New Jersey, was a paper boy shivering without a coat on. So my grandfather, the founder of, not the founder, but the continuing partner in that bank, decided to give the coat to the paper boy. Now understand, that was the only money they had was for the coat. That was my grandfather. And I'm glad that story is passed down, because that story will not appear in the New York Times of October, November of 1929. Other stories about him will. So that'll give you the first little story, you might say, that relates to family background and relates to indirectly to entrepreneurial risk, because entrepreneurial risk exists whenever you're stretching it a little bit, and they stretched it quite a bit.
Yeah.
So anyway, that'll give you a little bit of a background to that. My parents were wonderful parents. I cannot describe it better than that. You knew them slightly, to a degree, for a few years there,
Hmm.
but they were quite a bit older. Dad was born 1904, Mom 1906. And they would call themselves Edwardians, the Edwardian age of England, and they were a couple who were married in 1927, the same year that Lindbergh flew the Atlantic, and were married until my father died in 93. A long marriage, and they took videos, and they called the videos the good times, because they didn't have all good times.
Sure.
That's for sure. Nor do we all have good times. But they were rocks for me. They were the solid platform on which I could build my young life, knowing that I had them protecting my back. And they were there for me, for my sisters, my brother, and most especially for each other. That core of being there for each other. When you can, not everybody can have that. Not everybody has that in their background. Not everybody can have that. But when you can, it's very important to nurture that situation. So that gives a little bit of the background. Family generally from New Jersey, and that's where I was born. Now, where I'm from is a different place. I won't get into that. It makes an interesting story, but perhaps not a story appropriate for this podcast. Glad to go into it at some other point.
Sure.
But at the current moment, if somebody says, "Where are you from?" I will give a different answer, if they want, than where you're born. But I was born in New Jersey, spent a lot of my young life in New Hampshire, on my dad's back, hiking the presidential trail, part of the Appalachian Trail in northern New Hampshire, from one mountain to the other, ending up the highest mountain being Mount Washington. And that's where many years later, I was able to propose to your mother, and she gladly accepted it. It was near a cliff called Tuckerman's Ravine. I think there might have been a relationship between the ravine, the cliff, and her answer. I'm not saying what it was, but there might have been something on that. Anyway, from New Jersey, I moved out with my parents when I was about 11 to Bellevue, Washington, and I had attended a private school in New Jersey. I attended public school, which I liked an awful lot better. In Bellevue, graduated from Bellevue High School, and went thereafter to Princeton, where I met your mom on April 14th, 1967. Arguably the luckiest day of my life, without any doubt. Yeah, so we got married 2 years later, April 1st, 1969, and I was in the Army at the time. I had the opportunity to get drafted during the Vietnam era, an opportunity that I clearly did not want. I mean, understatement. Maybe some of your watchers and listeners, viewers of this venture here, will remember the history books about Vietnam. It was definitely not a positive time, American experience, It had some parallels with World War One,
Mm.
but definitely was not a good time to be in the service. Um, Proud to be in the service, that would be defined where perhaps in World War II, to do your service, but not necessarily in Vietnam, especially after about 1969. I
Mm.
was in from 68 to 70. Got sick after basic training,
Mm.
and that sickness has never gone away. Still have it today.
Mm.
That minor disability has affected me, but finally was recognized by the Veterans Administration a year and a half, a couple years ago.
Mm.
So pleased that happened.
Mm.
Been able to get some help with that.
Good.
So anyway, we were married, as they say, April 1969, and then we lived for a while in Missouri, where mom, having shifted from Douglas College, part of Rutgers University, to which was nearby Princeton. She moved from there to what was a branch of the University of Missouri at Rolla, Missouri, and she finished up her chemistry degree about the same time that I was able to get out of the service. And just before I got out of the service, I couldn't decide whether to go to business school or law schools. I applied to both. Got into more business schools, seemed to be headed towards business school. Northwestern seemed to be the most interesting one to go to in Chicago, and was Chicago. Speaking of Chicago, where you're from, largely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And was going to go there, but then an incident which sort of, since I was on the fence, no lawyers in the background, business people in the background. My dad, having been on Wall Street in many years, arguably the founder of Fortune magazine, interesting career with challenges and ups and downs, to say the least, but no lawyers. And but I was riding back in a carpool from the base back to home in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. There, and there was a woman who was having lots of trouble with her ex, with her former spouse. And I said, "Wait a minute, I can do something in business, but I can also try to help her as well. And so, which is the better route?" And I decided, okay, a little bit tougher route for me, I think. But that's always what I've tried to do. Let's go to law school.
Mm.
So during that period of time when I was in the Army, I'd also, and this is perhaps relevant for your folks, I also had a second job. I was in the Army, but I was selling mutual funds for a retired colonel on the side.
Mm.
So I had that second job, which was an interesting and challenging job to be doing that. I remember that I had my early success in selling a mutual fund plan to the cook doing KP duty in the Army. So here I was scrubbing out the pots, and the cook, the senior cook, was there listening to me, and I convinced him to buy my mutual funds. Now, if he had kept up those mutual funds, those investments that I had, if he had kept them up through the duration of the plan, he was going to make some money. On the other hand, back to the issue of fraud, or what you got to be careful of here, folks, is it turned out that 50% of the money put into that investment went to me for fees for the first year. In other words, if you invested $1,000 in that mutual fund sold by Larry, half of that, or $500 of that, went to me for my fee. And absolutely ridiculous. So how are you going to make money in that? And most people don't stick with those kind of programs. Years later, I went to apply for a job at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and they were investigating that same fund that I had worked for upstairs. And I say, guy asked me about my experience, and I didn't actually end up testifying, but it was very close. But it was a parallel testimony from other people. But anyway, that's to give you a little bit of a flavor. So after the Army, after law school, where I was a legal aid attorney in Baltimore City. So my first legal job was in West Baltimore, which was then the highest crime section of the highest crime city in the United States. Never was bothered. We did all kinds of crazy things in law. We would bring, if people wanted to get separated in a divorce kind of situation. There was no money. There was nothing to do it. We would take the couple into the senior attorney and ask them to raise their right hand. And senior attorney would say, well, by the power invested in me, you're hereby separated. That's the way we took care of the law in many respects in Baltimore in 1972. So, and then I with Kath, having at that point in tow was your oldest brother George, born in Baltimore. We moved to Bellevue, as I mentioned before, and I went the reverse direction. I went with the you might say the blue blood law firms, the big blue blood old time law firms where Princeton counted. Princeton didn't count for anything in Baltimore. You're kidding me. Yeah, legal aid, right? Well, the blue blood of the big law firms in Seattle. Worked for a couple of them until the Navy made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, which was come and work, be counsel for the Navy bases, primarily the Naval Supply Center, the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard, and later on the submarine base at Bangor and the torpedo station at Keyport. But then I also said, hey, I'll do it if I can have a private practice. And they ran it up the flagpole and determined that I could. So for all of the years, from 1975 until I retired from that job in 2003, I had two jobs. One job was for those naval activities, acting as counsel, civilian counsel for those activities. And then the other job was, in a way, entrepreneur. I had a private practice as long as it didn't conflict. So I had to report to them every now and then to make sure there was no conflict, report to the Navy folks. But I would do divorce law. I would do various projects that would come up. That would be including my brother had asked me to join with him in handling the jet foil that was operating in a triangular service between Vancouver, Victoria, and Seattle. So we helped the Canadians put together an entrepreneurship that worked for a while. We had two Boeing jet foils. One was a research under Canadian investment tax credit provisions, and then we had the other jet foil, and it was a great service for a short period of time, but it had problems with fuel costs and other things, and Boeing to some degree pulled the plug on that project. But it was fun in the 80s to do that. So that's just an example of the sort of entrepreneurial project that I enjoyed getting involved in as a sidelight to my, you might say, rock solid government job. And so going from there, continuing, would you like to hear more, or is that sufficient?
This is, keep going.
All right. So therefore, that covered things until the mid 80s in terms of things, and then of course, as you know, your brother Tony showed up, your brother Mike, and then you, and then your sister Liz, and Mom was getting involved in all kinds of cool projects, as you know, that she did. ultimately massage therapy, as well as managing this chaotic household of 5 kids. But some of my most enjoyable things during that period of time is I could get a real twofer out of one of them, which was soccer coaching. Because with soccer coaching, I was able to get, with doing both, I never coached George in soccer, but I coached Tony, your brother Tony, 1 year as assistant coach, and then 5 years with Mike's team, a short period of time with your team, and then 5 years with Liz's team. And then it was great to be able to do that. And then have George, for example, come in as coach of your team. And I remember that. That was a great thing to have that happen, to have your older brother coach you in soccer. I remember that very vividly, and with a great amount of joy. And then we took trips. I think your mom mentioned in her podcast that we took trips. Periodically, Kath and I would take trips, but then also I decided to make sure to take each of you individually on trips as I could when I had a business trip around the country. So everybody, I think, had pretty much an opportunity to do an individual trip with me to some crazy place in the country. And then later on, as you know, some crazy place in the world. That wasn't, those crazy places in the world were not part of a business trip, but they were well developed. Back again on this stream of consciousness podcast at the current moment.
Yeah.
Based upon an experience my father had, which taught me a lesson that perhaps I could pass along here. It might be of some value to your listeners, watchers there. He had gone with his mother to Europe in approximately 1910, a little bit later, maybe 1915, when he was a kid. He hated it. He hated the entire trip. He said the high point of the trip was watching a salamander in the Pope's garden in Rome. Now, he learned from that experience that you don't necessarily want to take kids on a vacation, especially in some place like Europe. Disneyland may be fine, but Europe when they're young, because all they're going to be interested in is where they're going to get the next ice cream cone.
Right.
So there's a time to go to Europe. So if you recall, took you and your sister, Mom and I took you and your sister when you were 16, and your sister was 14 to Europe. That was based upon the experience that my father had in the Pope's garden in Rome in approximately 1915. So sometimes there is some wisdom that can be transferred from one generation to another. That's just an example of that. So, that sort of, and then I retired in 2003 from the Navy jobs and continued doing the private work, which is what I enjoy doing now. And now that I don't have 2 jobs, and in fact, I just have one, I've reduced the scope of the job and only accept work which I enjoy. And sometimes it's commercial work, arbitrating with some of the giants of America companies, and some of it is the school district, where I'm the labor arbitrator between the Teachers Association and the school district. So I do cases with Amazon, and I do cases with the school district in Alaska and everywhere else. So it's enjoyable. It's enjoyable work.
It's good. A lot to dive in there. I mean, I guess if we think about in terms of business, law, and the general arc of history, there's there I have a lot of questions through that. So maybe the first one on the business front, maybe tied a little bit with the arc of history. Obviously, a lot has happened between 1929 and here we are in 2021, and there has been a number of business cycles in betwixt wars and other social movements that have brought the let's say quote unquote market, the U.S. and global market sort of up and down and left and right, zigzag. What's your general overall, I would say, reflections? If you wax poetic on economics for a little bit, reflecting on the arc of history between 1929 and now, what's your overall take? Like, what's going on geopolitically? How do these cycles work? I know this is an absolutely huge question, but I know you have a number of thoughts on it. And any lessons from that for entrepreneurs? Love to hear some thoughts.
Yes, that is a challenging question there, Will, but I'll sort of wade into it. And I guess the best way to wade into it is use my father's book. So I will do what a lot of folks do in podcasts and things and such, and to mention my father's book. My father, after his career, decided to, he took a course in novel writing from a professor at the University of Washington. And then he was the only one to actually write a novel. And might I say, I know that this will dwell into politics here for a second. This is the antidote to The Art of a Deal by a certain former president. This is the antidote to this. This book really says, okay, the art of business is integrity. Have it. Use it. Stay with it. Don't step out of a firm grasp of integrity. When I used to give ethics lectures in my Navy job, I would say, if you have a solid base of integrity, in other words, you know right from wrong, maybe from when you were a baby, then you don't need to pay an awful lot of attention to all these rules and regs that I'm going to tell you about now. But if you don't, my strong suggestion is pay close attention to them. So my suggestion is watch the regulators. Don't make fun of them. They may be 2 to 10 to 20 years behind the times, and they usually are, if you know what I mean. But don't make fun of them. Trust them to some degree. When you can, pay attention to them. If your business, if your entrepreneur is involving matters that are in regulation. So I'd say that's one suggestion. Integrity, overall, solid ethics, integrity. Don't split hairs. That's the first piece of advice, and that's what Candles for the Boardroom talks about. Secondly, I would say that trend-wise, over the years, it's sort of a cycle. We're back again to doing some of the stuff, some of the problems, some of the issues that were likely bugging us in the 20s. There's a lot of late 1920s that's involved in what we're doing now. Speculations of one kind or another, really out there. Now, I'm not saying that cyber-currency and Bitcoin at all resembles underwater land in Florida in 1928. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying there might be a potential of that. What is this vaporware kind of stuff? I mean, it doesn't have some solidness that it needs to have, and so that there's a certain wariness that people should have. I'm not saying that They want to be cynical about activities at the moment, but certainly skeptical pattern. So are we back to the 20s? No, we're never repeating. So I guess that would be lesson 2 or 3 here. We're never really strictly repeating history that occurred before, but there's a lot of patterns that are similar to where we were in the speakeasy days of the 1920s, where where the idea was to flaunt the law, and I think just to a large degree that's what happened in the 1920s, and of course it all came crashing down in 1929. Is that going to occur again? Probably not. We have in place protections and experience that had it, but there's going to be some parallels in that, and one should be careful of that. We've also gone through a huge transformation of revolutions here. We have had wars, but I think more significantly, starting, I would say, from that period that I'm talking about, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, Gulf Wars, that sort of thing, and now a confrontation with China that is likely to get heated up over the next 10 years. But we've also had, China had a cultural revolution, in quotes, which was hardly a cultural revolution. It was an internal massacre. We have a somewhat cultural revolution going on in this country as well. Now, whether you want to characterize it as something as a net positive or a net negative, I don't know. Depends upon one's perspective. One should not doubt, as an entrepreneur or just as an ordinary human being, that we have to always take into account the fact that we are going through some parallels to what China has gone through in a cultural revolution. There are things we cannot say and do today that we could say and do years past, and vice versa. There were things that other people couldn't say that we could say before, and those are the kinds of things. I think it is when one of my granddaughters approached me the other day and looked at me firmly and said, "Grandpa, where's your mask?" To which my instant response, based on the background, was to say, "Very, very well done, young Communist League member, young Nazi League member. What the heck are you doing ratting on your grandfather?" I didn't say anything, but there was part of me recording history that went, okay, there was a need, and there is a need for that mask from a standpoint of a health issue. But there's also another issue going on. And one needs to be really, really aware of the complexity of most of these issues. So I guess that might be lesson number 3 or 4, is when you can, remember F. Scott Fitzgerald's great quote, the sign of a really mature mind, this is approximately what the quote is, mature mind is to be able to hold 2 opposing thoughts at the same time and still be able to get something done. That's the key. One of the keys in life is to do that, is to be able to understand the complexity that might exist in 2 opposing thoughts or perspectives, but you also have to be able to move ahead. You have to actually be able to get something done. And so my smile to the 5-year-old granddaughter at the point and saying, here's the mask, because I was not about to explain to her, a 5-year-old, the complexities of her question and why her question raised something that Mao and Chou En-lai and Stalin would be very pleased with here. But on the other hand, where it was not very necessary from the standpoint of a health matter. So, but to be able to hold those competing thoughts, and I think it's rare. It's rare for somebody to be able to do that, but I certainly encourage that,
Mm,
and I think that's part of it. That's part of an able
mm, mm. Yeah, no, I always remember growing up, you telling us that holding both, like in a debate, for example, being able to debate any side is extraordinarily important so that you deeply understand each position so that you might be able to, if you're lucky, come up with a thoughtful, wise way to approach next steps for how to navigate whatever situation or whatever debate that you in. Obviously, this applies on multiple different levels of life, and certainly on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis when starting a company. Highly relevant. So I'd love to come back actually to the parallels between the 1920s and the 2020s because that's fascinating to me. You know, I think my colleagues and I've sort of sensed over even the last 5 to 8 years, everybody has thought, oh, this is going to all come crashing down at any moment. And then especially when the pandemic hit, everyone's like, oh, this is all going to come crashing down. And it didn't. So I'm curious, what is similar to the 20s and what isn't? Like what's different? Yeah, I think you had alluded to some things, but I'm curious, your general thoughts if you were to predict when or if things come crashing down, or maybe a bit of a whimper, how you would reflect on that with regard to parallels from the 1920s.
Well, I think the sense was in the 20s. Do the Charleston. I think it was the Charleston. You know, go to the speakeasies, get the illegal whiskey, and do some dancing, and don't worry about the future. That's my sense of it all.
Hmm.
And what was happening, of course, around the world is you had the Japanese Empire developing at that point. China was sort of being able to take over, and then there was these crazy nut murder types, namely the Nazis, taking over in Germany. Were we doing anything about it? No. Of course, both Winston Churchill and John Kennedy wrote books called "While England Slept." We ignored the issues. We ignored the issues as we Charlestoned on, in a sense. That's the 20s. Now, how much of a parallel? That's interesting. How much of a parallel are we? I think we're beginning to wake up a little bit. My sense is that the current administration is carried forward better than the previous administration to recognize the threat that exists with China. And I think it is a threat. I think China is a threat. And China thinks with their Belt and Loop Road, I can't remember, I wrote about it recently, but they think long term. The United States has a problem in thinking like the Charleston thing that I mentioned, where they danced on and didn't think about, hey, what was happening overseas. America first. Well, that's what was woken up on December 7th, 1941. That ended America first. Japanese were stupid enough to bomb us out of our complacency. What is going to bomb us out of our complacency and understand that we have multiple problems? First, internationally, we have all of this threat, and at the same time, we're overextending ourselves economically. Do we have really the capacity to do all these trillions of dollars of debt that we're passing along? Where are we with that? How can we do that? And at the same time as we want to defend and resupply our infrastructure, necessary, yes. So it's a real challenge for the policymakers to figure out how to do it when we're actually decreasing our defense budget. We're decreasing the defense budget in real terms, increasing our domestic spending at the time in which we have international concerns of a tremendous nature, at the same time as we have a huge domestic revolution going on that we've had going on really since the late 60s. as I say, our own brand of cultural revolution going on.
Mm.
So these challenges provide a format. Each one of your meetings that you have with your proto team, you are indirectly discussing issues which have to do with the cultural revolution that's going on, with the whole issue of economics and how the economics of the country is going to affect what you're doing. But you can't ignore the long run.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been privy to a number of business ventures, starting, bombing, some of them successful. What advice from a pure business entrepreneurial perspective? I'm going to ask about maybe some legal law things later, but from a pure business entrepreneur starting a business perspective, what advice do you have for the entrepreneurs listening in, based on your extensive experience watching this and participating in it up close and personal over the years?
Well, watching your success, Will, has amplified some of the my understanding of this course. First, this is about friends and community first. You by and large need to have confidence in the people around you, the people who are backing you. This is not, you're not an island. You're not operating as an entrepreneur alone. There are others you need to help you. You need to reach out when you have an idea that has some tested validity to it. You need to reach out to your community for not only advice but also backing as you initially can, and to treat that community well, and to be sure that you have trust. You're back to the issue of integrity. Sure that you trust them, because you can have a whole pile of NDAs, and you know what their value is, nominal. Matter of fact, sometimes worse than not having it. The old handshake is still not that we could do it. Perhaps we can get back into post-COVID things soon, so we can have the handshake again. But because that's the key. The key is to have the trust in those that are around you, and listen to the moms. There's an awful lot of wisdom, as you know, in your mom, my wife of 52 years. A lot of wisdom there. And who is it? Now I'm speaking to your clan there, your entrepreneurial clan. Who is it can be your mentor in that thing, your alter ego, to say, wait a minute, hold on, have you thought of X? How about Y? What about Z? And pay attention to that. So you need that community. You need to have those folks around, and I think that's the first, really the first or second step. First step is obviously the idea, the concept, the what you're going to do in that sense. But then the second is the community around which you can build your enterprise, and to have somebody who is not going to be necessarily financially involved in that thing, or who you can go to, the proverbial little old grandma, to be able to pass the idea by, and to see that. So that I think would be maybe the first couple of stages, and you're going to get very soon into that, to get the kind of, if you can, get the kind of advice that you need. That includes my bias now showing up here, including legal, is to be able to get, if you can, not necessarily the total blue blood big law firm types, that are now pushing $1,000 an hour. You don't want to, you don't need that and want that, but you need to get somebody who's perhaps working as I started my private practice. I didn't know what to charge, and I was doing the private practice at the same time as I had a Navy job. I didn't know what to charge, so because I was just working on the kitchen table, and so I just $50 an hour sounds like a good charge. But this is a lot of years ago, though. But still, $50 an hour. And I got the president of the local bar association who gave me a call. Hey, Larry, I understand you're charging $50 an hour. I said, sure, Mike. God rest his soul. He's gone now. Hey, Mike, yeah, I'm charging. You might want to consider, obviously, price fixing. That would really, luckily he's no longer with us and I can speak. Mike was a great guy, so no problem with Mike. But anyway, so that's the point. But you might want to get somebody that maybe not operating from the kitchen table, but certainly not charging $1,000 an hour either.
Yeah. Plenty of firms with their well over $1,000 now, top tier, and they'll often defer. Yeah, entrepreneurs listening in, you'll be careful with those firms because they'll defer their payment until you raise a sizable round. But sometimes that payable can rack up to 6 figures or more.
Oh yeah,
and you have a huge liability on your books, and you think you got that for free, but
no. There's no free lunch. There's no free lunch, and I used to watch because I used to spend time helping entrepreneurs find lawyers. I remember some unique situations where in those days it was probably around $500 an hour, but they would be talking about their fishing trip. Now, there's nothing wrong with talking about the fishing trip, but if a lawyer goes on for 15 minutes to a half an hour talking about the fishing trip, you got to watch it because that's going to get billed. You're going to end many cases. Sort of reminds me of one of the first cases I had at the first law firm. I was reviewing this giant stack of depositions, and I fell asleep in my office reading those depositions into the evening, right? So I went into the senior attorney, and I said, what should I do here? I fell asleep, reading these depositions. He said, I'm not surprised you fell asleep. That's incredibly boring. What should I charge him? Charge him for every single minute, including the time I was asleep? And he said, yes. That's an integrity issue. That's a law firm. If you get an idea of that, my suggestion is, if you can, shift firms.
Yeah. No, that's good. That's a pile of really good advice there. And just then hyper practically, given that you've done this a lot, what are the tips for a startup founder when they're going after an attorney? He said, look for somebody who's not necessarily a kitchen table, not somebody who's not necessarily charging $1,000, somewhere in the middle. Are there questions or things that you would ask of these attorneys as you're hunting for them, or what?
Yes. What you really want to do is first you want to get a sense of whether they're an island or not. I mean, this is my bias. You do want to get a little bit of a sense that they're not. You want to make sure it's clear that they're not charging you. Back to your issue of they may charge you in the long run, but in the short run, they're not going to charge you for this initial meeting. You want to find out what makes them tick. You want to find out, take a little hint from the Japanese perspective on this. Spend some time finding out about their family. You want to talk about what makes them where they are. How come they became a lawyer? What animates them? What do they do in their spare time? What's family all about to them? Now, you have to be sort of careful in that area. Back to the Cultural Revolution issue. But you need to get an idea of what makes this person who's going to give you advice tick. Because otherwise, they're giving you're hearing advice, but you don't know where that advice comes from deeply. You know the surface of it, but you don't need it deeply. So you want to get a clue to the person first, if you can. So that's to my mind, there's tremendous value in initial difficult in today's, still Zoom kind of context to get that real that real context of the individual. But you need to get that if you can. Secondly, you want to find out what understanding background they have in your particular area. In other words, if they haven't touched anything at all having to do with, with fraud involving issues of healthcare or whatever they might happen to be, then I would be careful about deal with that attorney unless the attorney has some parallels. No, I don't. But here's what I've done that's somewhat similar to X, Y, and I particularly like your proposition that you told me about because of A, B, and C. Have they done their homework? Have they? That would be the second thing. Get to know the person first. Secondly, have they done their homework before they met with you? Have you sent them a text? Have you sent them something that shows something? And have they actually read it? Have they actually spent some time? In other words, an expression of interest, and how that is either what they've done before or something that they can say that is close to what they've done before that they really would like to get into, and why. Why are they interested in it? So that there's got to be a certain, just like with the entrepreneur, you're looking for that light bulb. You're looking for that spark that somebody has, that they're excited about it. You're looking for that spark also in in an indirect partnership with a lawyer, because that's what it is. You should, as an entrepreneur in general, have a lawyer if you can. This is the ideal that you are working with, who's a junior partner in your enterprise. In other words, it's not somebody billing by hour. It's just like my concept is that when you can, an established business should give their employees, for which there's some duration of employment in the employee, a part of the action. In other words, you shouldn't have employees, in my opinion, in general, who simply paid. They should be also getting part of the action. In the same sense, I think that the lawyer, after a while, after you're confident of it, should have I don't know, 1% of the company.
I've heard some lawyers say that can create potentially some conflict of interest if they have ownership in the company. Is that true, or was that maybe something I heard with somebody?
No, it can be true. Yes. But what you want to do is to work through that. In other words, conflicts of interest are usually able to be either taken care of, or certain blocks can be made to make sure the conflicts of interest are not a problem. So yes, you can have an appearance of a conflict, or an actual conflict exists with that, and that often happens with a firm that will have with a single partner or an associate will have a interest in a firm, and then because there's so many other partners or other adventures going on, other clients, there can be a conflict in it. That is now so you'll usually find the non-conflict situations in solo practitioner lawyers. Then there's less conflict in because they can do conflicts checks with themselves. They're looking at the left and looking at the right of themselves. But a conflicts check is a big deal for a large law firm with a major project, because they've got to check with they might have 500 partners around the world. They got to make sure that there's no conflict. Often, good luck, especially an entrepreneur. They're not going to take an entrepreneur on because they've got they might have they might have a connection with Facebook in Germany. Who knows?
Right. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good practical advice. So going more meta then, coming back to the arc of the last 50, 60 years around the US's own flavor of cultural revolution. It seems like, especially over the last 10, 15 years, but really heating up in the last 5 years or so, 5, 10 years, that we are a divided country. Now, I've been watching Hamilton on repeat over and over and over again, and just a lot of the issues, even when our country was being formed. This is nothing new, of course. But what do you say, and what are your reflections when people are so concerned about how polarized the country is, so concerned about things you can say and not say? Is there hope for our country that you see politically moving forward, or is this or do we have a lot of bad news in front of us? What's your overall take?
Best advice, and that is to go fishing. In other words, turn off the TV, turn off the computer. Don't watch it for a while. Take a breather from it for a while. The media, it's clicks. You're clickbait, right? And so they wanted, the media in general is part of the problem, because their idea is to sell. I mean, the old days it was newspapers, still is for me, I guess. Since I write for one, right? It's sales, and it's money, and controversy generates clicks, and so I don't think deep down, this is personal opinion. Mm-hmm. Deep down, this country is divided as much as the media and media portrays it being. I really don't. If you ask people, what are their really? Do you think, for example, there's tremendous value in having more women involved in enterprises, including in your general business? Do you think that's a good idea? I think you're going to have wide spectrum agreement, for example, in that. Are there complexities that are involved even in that kind of issue? Yes. And should they be explored? Yes, they should. But I think if you can find a group for which you can have an open discussion about that issue or any other issue, then I think you're part of the way home free. As I say, I think there is I think there's a perception that the country is divided more than it really is. I'll take one example. I think most people in this country really believe that the Supreme Court is, as Judge Posner of the appellate court would say, a political court. And it's really making decisions on a political basis and not on the basis of the law and the facts. Well, I have to put blinders on every now and then, because there is part of me who goes along with Judge Posner and believes U.S. Supreme Court and state Supreme Courts are political courts, and they are where politics and the law meet. But a lot of decisions, the vast majority of decisions, are either unanimous or very close to unanimous, and that I think should be quieting to folks who believe that we really are, culturally divided, and it's wonderful to see entrepreneurs of all types develop. And it's also, I think this is a story I think you've heard before, but coming out of as a legal aid attorney in Center City, Baltimore, when I was supervising the Office of Counsel at Oakland, California, the counsel there, Marcia, was a Black woman. And she said, "Hey, Larry, I've been working with you for a while. I think you think most Black people are poor. Don't you, Larry?" And I said, "Marcia, I think you're right. I think I have a bias. I think most Black people in this country are poor." She said, "Come here, Larry. I'm going to take you for a drive. I'm going to show you where I live." She showed me where she lived in Oakland Heights, wherever it was in Oakland Heights. A hell of a lot more expensive a home than we lived in. Let's put it that way. So people have different concepts, different biases and different concepts. And I think we can all educate each other in all different directions about this. That's why, as I say, there's kind of a cultural revolution going on. It's not all bad at all. It's got a lot of good aspects to it. I think we're going to come out of it. I think we're going to come out of it stronger, more united, less divided. But there are the polarizing forces, such as the media.
So, what about for you personally? Where are you? What projects are you working on? What meta questions are you pondering? I know this is a multiple part question, so feel free to take it wherever you want. But just for you personally, how are you perceiving your time now and perceiving this coming decade in terms of the things that you're paying attention to?
Well, internally, I keep, as Mom does with her great project as mother guardian for Little Sisters of St. Clair, works on it on her inner work more daily than I do. Hmm. My sort of inner work is largely my long-standing book project that I've been working on for off and on for 30 years. But that's really a very introspective project. Many of the chapters are introspective in nature. So it continues to be fun to do that. And I think I'm going to be back into doing some more interviews when this is the standard Zoom interview, the podcast interview, but when they're in person. So that's the interior work. But I find it helpful to me to be both doing inner work and to have projects, a diverse set of projects that are in the outer work. In other words, am I solving some issues, both commercial issues that are involved, employment issues that I have? I mean, I have cases now that are employment issues, commercial interests, as well as issues between labor unions and particular entities of one kind or another, including, as I mentioned, most interesting to me often are school districts. I mean, I've had to help a school district decide how they were going to implement their schedule in the COVID timeframes, that sort of stuff. That's fascinating, as well as trying to figure out whether there are some serious problems with certain of the new artificial intelligence things that that are constantly and present in our homes every day. Those even that we might talk to. I'm not saying anything specifically there, but you get the idea. So it is fun to. I find it to be keeps the mind, especially when somebody is approaching 75 like me, to keep the mind active at all times. And also for me, it's fun. It is fun. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is part of happiness. Happiness is the little grandchild. Happiness is seeing the children, including you. We call you a child. It's a bit misnomer, but you get the idea. The adult children that I have doing so well, that's happiness. And to see the wife as wonderful as Kathy is after 52 years. But it's also keeping the mind active, both in the interior sense and the exterior sense. And being able to, in that exterior sense, something that's very important to me is the feeling that you're helping people. The feeling that you're actually doing something which furthers a pursuit that is positive.
So I have two questions left. One is around what entrepreneurs and the tech community should be thinking about specifically with regard to China and other forces in the world that potentially could be a bit of a metaphorical, if not literal, battleground for us. And then the second question is around just your general thoughts or advice for the entrepreneurs listening in. But let's start with China. As an entrepreneurial community, how much should we be paying attention to this as we are building new technologies, working a lot with data, working a lot with AI?
Hmm.
working a lot with sovereignty of data, sovereignty of control, privacy,
Hmm.
etc.
Hmm.
How much should we be paying attention to China, or how much does that worry you, or is this something that is maybe we're overblowing a little bit, or what's your overall take?
Well, I had a senior partner at one of the large firms that I worked at who, Paul Ashley, used to be Ashley Pepper, Foster Pepper and Riviera. Paul Ashley wrote a book called On Prenuptial Agreements, in which the title was Promise Me Anything, but Put It in Writing.
Mm.
I'm using that not only, obviously, not only in the context of prenuptial agreements, but in other words, trust but verify. When it comes to China, I'm not saying the Chinese people, like people everywhere, are wonderful. There's nothing wrong with the Chinese people. They just got a thugocracy going on, right? They they have a dictatorship operating there. That's what the Communist Party is. I don't know whether it's communist really anymore, but it's a dictatorship. But on the other hand, they're doing in many respects very well. They're giving up a lot of personal freedoms, but within the context of that, and how we should not treat them only as an adversary. That doesn't mean we should not treat them as an adversary, and we should be very wary about anything which can come, with intellectual property of any kind coming anywhere near them. And of course, we know that it's coming near them because they're in our universities. They're 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 sort of everywhere. But they are. I'm sincerely still hopeful that what the guy in the Chinese embassy told myself and the students about 10 years ago when we had a session with the ambassador there, charged affair anyway at the embassy. The student raised a hand and said, Mr. Ambassador, charged affair, whatever it was, are you guys going to turn into a democracy? To which the charged affair says, we're moving in that direction. To which my initial answer is, bullshit. Yes, in a way that's true. So in other words, you have to keep the bullshit meter really going good when it comes to China and when it comes to a lot of the other challenges, Russia as well. You have to be very careful because they, especially China, have a long range plan.
Mm.
They're not doing stuff in Africa. They're not building community elsewhere. They're not doing things which appear to be very nice, developing ports, doing everything that they might happen to be. They're not doing that out of the generosity of their heart. They're doing it for two reasons, one of which is quite legitimate. Indians are doing it, we're doing it, whatever democracies are doing it. Make a buck, nothing wrong with that. But they're also doing it to spread their particular brand of governance. And we are in tight control with them, and we will be. And the test will be, of course, when their landing craft land across the Taiwan Straits, which I think is going to happen sometime in the next 10 years. So do we need to be careful? We need to be cautious. We need to recognize that they're everywhere. They're within our corporations, our large corporations. They're everywhere. On the other hand, the long range should be regime change in effect in China, and we recognize that Chinese people are not our enemy. The government is an enemy that we have to. I was glad that Biden shook hands with Putin. I hope he shakes hands with Xi. I might have a different reaction to Xi than I would even to Biden, to Putin, because I think he might even be one level worse, if that's possible, than Putin. And I think he might be. But we do have to work with them. We hope to encourage. I still have one side. We've got to have a strong enough military to persuade them not to invade Taiwan. And on the other hand, we have to have enough cooperation to recognize that that we need to deal with them. So, what about how does that translate for entrepreneurs? Watch it. Be extremely scrupulous. Be careful of it, but don't completely stay away from anything Chinese. If somebody wants to meet with the Chinese folks, you got a sidebar thing that you want to do with the Chinese. I'm not saying don't do that. Just be very, very aware that there is an agenda. You may not see the agenda, but the agenda is there. They may be thinking 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. You're thinking 6 months out at the most. They're thinking 6 years or more. And so just be aware of that, but don't ignore dealing with somebody simply because they may be a scumbag.
So if you were to wrap up the conversation, then any final? Obviously, I have a million questions I want to continue asking, but we are at time. Any final thoughts or reflections from this conversation to the to the audience?
Since your audience is largely entrepreneurs, I trust, you should be congratulated. Your community should be congratulated. You are the new elite of this country. You're not in a sophisticated sense of prestige of knowing exactly which of wine to choose. Not that kind of elite, but the new sort of effective citizens that are going to be the core of the future. It used to be in my generation. We would consider professionals, the doctors, lawyers, et cetera, who were kind of the elite of the 60s, 70s, 80s, maybe into the 90s. You folks have become the new, and you should be congratulated for having the guts, the risk. You're taking risk every day in what you're doing, and you should be careful with that. But avoid, as I don't know what I was on the thing when I talked about the Davy Crockett expression. The worst expression of all is this famous Davy Crockett one: "Be sure you're right, and then go ahead." Well, you would never go ahead. That's the absolute opposite of an entrepreneur. You should be congratulated as entrepreneurs. So be wary, be careful. Have in the back of your mind, you need to be aware that there are the forces of, like I described about 1929, that are there. But you shouldn't be overly afraid. And if you have some courage, life can really be a really great apple. Enjoy it. Take a bite every now and then.
So where can people find more about you? I know you have a column in the Kitsap Sun. If people are interested in following your work or getting a hold of you, how can they do that?
I'll talk to you. Talk to you. And of course, that's one way to do it. Sure. I'm always glad there's all my columns from years ago. I write every 2 weeks, as you know. And so we've done it for ages. And it would be, you can find me at kitsapsun.com, and both online and in print on Sunday. I forget the in print on Sunday unless you live in Kitsap County, Washington. But the paper's getting thinner and thinner, but the online community is growing.
Nice.
And well, it's fun. Thank you very much for doing this, Will. You're doing a community service as well as a service for your community.
Well. Thank you, Pop. This has been a great initial conversation. I'll look forward to more. Appreciate your time.
You got it.
Yeah.
Have a good day, everybody. Bye now. Thank you, Will.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number 2, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.